There are reunions that don't begin with words, only with a glance, a breath, a single step stopping at the boundary between human and wild. Have you ever loved something so deeply that you let it go, just because you knew it needed to be free? Eric once did, and for many years, he carried in his heart the image of a creature that never belonged to him, but never truly left him either. A lion, named Leo. The story you are about to hear is not a legend, it happened, and by the time you reach the final minute, you might begin to believe that true love has no species, no time, and no limits. Take a deep breath, and prepare to step into the wildlife sanctuary, where a miracle once took place. Among the wind, among the tall grass, and between two hearts that once belonged to each other, forever. No one moved, no one dared to breathe too hard. Everyone stood frozen, like turned to stone, because right in front of them, under the blazing sunlight reflecting off the thin layer of dusk-dusted air, stood a full-grown male lion, muscles rippling, burning golden eyes locked onto the man just a few steps away, Eric. A soft breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of sweat and tension. The rangers surrounding the sanctuary kept their hands close to the triggers of their tranquilizer guns. Everyone knew, one wrong move, and blood could be spilled on this field. But Eric didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid, not because he was foolish, but because he had once been the only father this lion had ever known. His name was Leo, and to understand why a full-grown, fierce lion, ruler of an entire territory, was now looking at Eric not as prey, but as a doorway back to a memory. You'd have to go back to the beginning, to the place where it all started, with an abandoned lion cub, and a man who couldn't walk away. Years ago, Eric was driving through a semi-desert region, far from the main roads of South Africa. He was a freelance biologist, a former soldier who had since dedicated his life to studying the bond between humans and wild animals. On a forgotten dirt road stained red by the earth, he spotted what appeared to be a discarded trash bag. But then, it moved. A tiny bundle of fur, breathing rapidly, heartbeat faint, a lion cub not yet fully able to open its eyes. Abandoned and starving, no sign of a pride, no roars in the distance, no hope. Eric stood still for a few seconds. He knew this went against the rules. Both the laws of man and nature warned against bringing home a future predator. But still, he knelt down, gently wrapped the cub in his worn leather jacket, and whispered, "You're not going to die alone, little one." He named him Leo, because the first glimpse the cub opened his eyes, they shone like the blazing sun. In those early weeks, Leo slept beside Eric, clinging to him like a kitten. He was playful, affectionate, and insisted on wrapping his paws around Eric's neck at night. On cold, windy evenings, Eric would sit reading, while Leo rested his head on his leg, breathing softly like a sleeping child. People called Eric crazy, but he didn't care, because in a wooden cabin deep in the wild, two beings the world had forgotten had found each other. Time passed as swiftly as the wind. Leo now weighed over 100 kilograms. His mane had grown thick around his neck, forming a dark halo. The once clumsy footsteps now carried the force of an apex predator. What started as innocent play, Leo chasing Eric's hand shadows, nibbling at his pant legs, soon became heavier. The playful swats packed more weight. Gentle licks sometimes grazed into light scratches. Eric began to feel what he had always known would come. Leo was not a pet. He was wild. Eric built a large enclosure in the garden, spacious, with trees and a shelter that resembled a miniature desert. But each night, Leo would let out a low rumble, calling for him. When Eric sat outside reading, Leo lay inside the enclosure, eyes fixed on him, as if afraid that one day, he might disappear. One morning, as Eric entered the enclosure like always to feed him, Leo suddenly pounced, not out of anger, not out of hunger, but because he was too strong, too instinctual. Eric fell to the ground, pinned beneath two massive front paws. Leo didn't roar, he just looked at him. A moment stretched on like an entire epic. A moment when man and beast both realized they no longer lived in a world of childhood. Eric gently stroked Leo's head. "You're ready to go, aren't you?" And that was when his heart began to crack open. Not from fear, but from something more sacred than kinship. Truth. Leo needed to return to his world. And Eric Had to learn how to let go. Eric went 3 nights without sleep. Inside the windless wooden cabin, once a home for 2 lonely souls, only the soft growls from the lion's enclosure echoed in the silence. Leo sensed something was changing. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. Every time Eric came near, Leo would nuzzle his head into the man's arm, as if trying to hold on to every familiar breath. Eventually, Eric made the call to a large wildlife sanctuary far in northern Namibia. A place with open forests, grasslands, and a respected wildlife rewilding program. They agreed to take Leo. The morning of their farewell, the sky seemed intentionally grayer. Leo didn't roar, didn't resist. He simply walked the edges of his enclosure quietly, as though searching for a way out of destiny. A transport truck pulled into the yard. 2 conservation officers in sand-colored uniforms stepped down, carrying a steel transport crate, colder and more sterile than any cage Eric had ever seen. Eric opened the gate. Leo didn't back away. He didn't rush forward. He just looked at him. And that look pierced through flesh and bone, straight into the heart, and made Eric want to run, to cancel everything. But he couldn't. He stepped forward, knelt before Leo, and wrapped his arms around the great head. The same one that used to curl against his chest on rainy nights. His hands trembled, his eyes blurred. You're a warrior, Leo. You weren't born to live in a cage, even one built with love. Leo lowered his head. A small, rumbling growl vibrated from his chest. And then, for reasons no one could explain, he stepped into the crate on his own. The door shut. The truck pulled away. Eric stood frozen, his hand clutching a single strand of Leo's mane that had caught on the fence. People often think the most painful goodbyes are between humans. But sometimes, it's the soul of a wild animal that leaves behind the deepest emptiness. 5 years passed. Eric never took in another animal. The wooden cabin remained the same. The old lion enclosure had become a small garden. But each morning, he'd still glance that way, as if something hadn't truly ended. Leo was no longer within reach. But he had never left Eric's heart. From time to time, the sanctuary sent letters. They said Leo was healthy, adapting well, and had become an unusually strong male. But he rarely interacted with others, neither human nor beast. Eric felt proud and sad. One late afternoon near the end of the dry season, fallen leaves covered the path to his front porch. Eric's phone rang. An unknown number, with an international code. He hesitated, then answered. Mr. Eric Walker? Yes, this is he. This is Mara, supervisor of the Namib sanctuary. I believe you need to come here. Eric froze. Is something wrong with Leo? There was a pause on the other end, as if the woman was carefully selecting her words. We're not entirely sure, but today, you need to hear this. A bit of static from a microphone. Then an audio recording. It wasn't a roar, not a typical wild sound. It was a low, resonant moan, somewhere between a roar and a cry. Drawn out, trembling, and it only echoed when someone stood near the fence of Section C, where Leo lived. Mara's voice returned, slower, quieter. The lion you raised, he just did something unprecedented. He roared, but not to threaten. He roared, to call someone. Eric dropped the phone, eyes wide. Every buried emotion surged up, stinging like desert sun. Could it be? Leo remembered? Could he recognize a breath? Just from the sound of a footstep? Eric looked to the horizon, where the sky burned red like memory. And he knew. It was time to return. The plane landed under the scorching sun of Namibia. Hot winds swept in, carrying the scent of dust and bitter sap from a wilderness that had never bowed to man. Eric stepped off the runway with a small backpack and a heart heavy as lead. Waiting for him was Mara, the sanctuary supervisor. She had the eyes of someone who had witnessed the extraordinary, but still wasn't sure she believed it. I need to say this first. Eric, Leo isn't the lion cub you once raised. I know. But I'm not the same man I used to be either. They traveled deep into the sanctuary in a pickup truck, past miles of sun-scorched savanna, where dry leaves seemed to evaporate beneath the sun. When they reached the ranger station, Mara stopped the vehicle. She turned to him. Leo is in Section C. But no one dares get close anymore. Last week, he broke the safety fence when a stranger approached. We thought he was injured, but he wasn't. He just becomes aggressive when anyone comes near. Except yesterday. When we played the recording. Eric nodded, swallowing something that felt like fear. But also, hope. By the time they reached Section C, the sun was already leaning toward dusk. Its rays fell through the steel fence, and a golden shape emerged behind the brittle shrubs. Leo. No one had to point. No sign was needed. Eric recognized him instantly, the way one knows their own flesh and blood. Thick mane, eyes glowing like embers. His body, larger than any lion nearby. Majestic. Yet there was a faint, trembling. When he saw Eric. Eric stepped out of the truck, empty-handed. He took off his hat, removed his sunglasses. Only his bare heart remained. And a familiar voice from long ago. Leo, it's me. It's your Eric. Leo didn't roar. He just walked, slowly, toward the fence. 1, 2, 3 steps. No one dared breathe. He stopped in front of the fence, looked directly at him, and then, he bowed his head, pressed his forehead to the steel bars, closed his eyes. Eric stepped forward, placed his hand on that spot. Steel stood between them, but love did not. Leo exhaled, a deep, shuddering breath, as if the whole desert had just been released. The sound of metal echoed, dry and sharp. The iron gate slid open, first a crack, then wider, until there was nothing left between a man and a full-grown lion weighing over 400 pounds. Wild, powerful, and completely unpredictable. Eric stepped in first, slowly. No armor, no weapon, only memory, only a fragile hope that somewhere deep inside, Leo still remembered the name. Dad. Not a sound came from behind the fence. Everyone held their breath. Even the veteran staff couldn't hide their fear. Because the lion standing there was nothing like the cub they'd once heard stories about. Leo turned his head. His amber gold eyes glinted in the evening light. There was no hostility, but neither was there certainty. He stepped out of the shadow. Closer. Each footfall pressing the dry grass like waves going silent in the eye of a storm. 5 meters. 3 meters. 1 meter. No space left between man and beast. Eric bowed slightly. No trembling. And softly, like whispering to a memory, he said, Leo, if you still remember me, now is the time. And then, Leo roared. Not the roar of a predator, but the roar of a heart remembering something it had almost forgotten. And as if a dam burst, he charged, but not to attack. Leo didn't leap at Eric's throat. Didn't bite. Didn't growl. He stopped right in front of him. Pressed his head into Eric's chest. Sniffed. Breathed. Rubbed against him. And then, he purred. A deep, rumbling purr, like an oversized house cat rediscovering home. The sanctuary erupted in stunned silence. A wild lion had remembered the man who once saved his life. Eric sank to his knees, cradled that massive head, crowned in golden mane, and wept, not out of fear, but because the miracle had come true. Right in the moment the world had given up on wild things remembering love. Eric remained seated, his hands buried deep in the thick mane of Leo. The lion's breath rumbled like wind gliding over hills of grass. But then, the massive head nuzzling his shoulder suddenly froze. Leo sprang upright, his ears perked, eyes locked on the forest edge, where the bushes trembled, though no wind stirred. A low, nearly inaudible growl rippled from Leo's chest. Eric felt it too. The air had shifted. No longer was this just a heartwarming reunion. It was now a battlefield in waiting. A ranger's voice crackled quietly through the radio. Eric, don't move. Leo's protecting you from something. Eric looked up, and followed Leo's gaze. At the far boundary, just beyond where sunlight faded, something watched, unmoving, a pair of deep crimson eyes. Patient, measuring. That's Zachar, someone whispered. The dominant male of the pride. He doesn't tolerate intruders, especially former captives. Eric felt a knot twist in his stomach. Zachar, a name everyone in the reserve spoke with caution. No one approached him unarmed. No one challenged him. And now, Leo, the same lion who once slept curled in Eric's arms, stood between his human and a king of the wild. Leo didn't roar, didn't lunge. He simply stood, firm, still, like a living wall. Zachar stepped forward, slow, deliberate, muscles rippling beneath dark, scarred skin, his face a map of battles won and survived. No roar, no growl, just a stare, first at Eric, then at Leo. And that was enough to make every ranger raise their tranquilizer rifles. But Leo didn't flinch, didn't back down. His back legs dug in. Head low, eyes fixed. Eric whispered, "Leo, don't lose your freedom for me." But perhaps at this moment, Leo was no longer just a wild animal. He was a guardian, and Eric was still his family. The wind stilled. The golden savanna held its breath. Zachar, the reigning lion, took another step forward. Each pawfall sent a subtle tremor through the earth. Leo remained unmoved, a wall of muscle and memory standing guard before Eric. But Eric sensed something shifting in Leo's eyes. Not fear, not anger, but an invisible war. A silent tug of war between the wild beast and the boy who once fell asleep cradled in his arms. Then Zachar roared, a deep, resonant thunder that rippled across the entire reserve. Not just a sound, but a declaration, a final challenge. A voice crackled into Eric's earpiece. If Leo answers that roar, they'll fight, to the death. Eric didn't know where the courage came from, but he stepped forward, just one pace beyond Leo's shadow. The air held still, even the trees stood silent. "Leo," he whispered, voice trembling, "you don't have to prove anything. Not to me, not to anyone." Leo turned his head, looked at him, and in those golden eyes, Eric saw something achingly human. Memories flickering like embers, stormy nights, whispered lullabies, a boy too small for his roar, curled up against a soldier's chest. One heartbeat, then another, and Leo did not roar. Instead, he turned to Zachar, lowered his head, not in surrender, but in something greater than dominance. In remembrance, in love. Zachar paused, visibly taken aback. No one had ever yielded to him like this. Not with dignity, not without fear. He stared at Leo, then at Eric, and then he walked away. No blood, no battle, just a lion who chose loyalty over instinct. Eric exhaled, knees nearly giving out beneath him, but his heart swelling with something too large to name. Not relief, not triumph, but the awe of witnessing a soul choose love when the world expected war. Zachar had retreated. Not a single drop of blood touched the ground. No roars followed in his wake. All that remained was Leo, standing silently in an air that had just survived a storm no eyes could see, only hearts could feel. Eric dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. Sweat soaked the back of his shirt. But it wasn't from fear. It was the crushing weight of emotion. A wild lion had chosen to protect him, had chosen to back down for him. Leo turned around, his amber eyes locked onto Eric's. He was no longer the lion cub who once curled up in blankets or begged for food by pawing at the leg of a chair. He was a creature of nature, of wind and fire and ancient bloodlines. And yet, in those eyes, Eric still recognized a sliver of memory, a piece of soul. Leo walked toward him, not aggressively, not threateningly, just a slow, steady approach, until he gently rested his head against Eric's shoulder, as if whispering something Eric couldn't understand, but felt completely. Eric placed a hand on Leo's neck, his fingers touching the thick, warm fur, still dry despite the wind-heavy sky above. "You never forgot," he whispered, "and neither did I." For a moment, the boundary between man and beast dissolved. There were only two living beings, once a part of each other, now touching one last time, before the world forced them to part in different directions. The wild wind began to rise over the tall grasses. The rustling leaves sounded like a farewell song. No drums, no tears, just the solemn silence that nature reserves for the sacred. Leo lifted his head from Eric's shoulder. He didn't roar, he didn't thrash, just one final look, long enough to etch itself into Eric's memory, like the touch of something eternal. Then he turned. 4 steady legs moved without hesitation, each step increasing the distance between him and the man who had once been his whole world. Eric didn't call out, didn't reach out to stop him. He simply stood there, his eyes following the lion's back, as it slowly disappeared into the fading yellow grass, into the deep red dusk of the wild land. When Leo's silhouette finally vanished behind the trees, Eric exhaled at last, not from relief, but because he had just witnessed something far beyond instinct. A lion that knew how to love, and knew how to let go. A wildlife ranger stepped beside him, her face still pale. "You know," she murmured, I've worked here 9 years. I've never seen anything like that. Eric only nodded, his gaze still fixed on the empty space where Leo had disappeared. Me neither, he whispered. But I've never loved anyone like that either. You see, this isn't just a story about a man and a lion. It's a story about a love that goes beyond instinct, beyond species, beyond time and memory. Leo grew up in the wild, became a symbol of untamed nature. And Eric, he learned something no school could ever teach. That when you truly love something, you don't try to keep it for yourself. You simply stand still and protect it with your heart. We may never see another lion like Leo again. But if you've ever lost someone, a pet, or something that once meant the world to you, then you understand. True love doesn't need to possess. It only needs to be remembered. Leave a lion emoji. If your heart, too, went still the moment Leo turned and disappeared into the forest. And if you believe that real connection never fades, share this story with someone who might need the reminder. Love doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it only needs to exist.